Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of medieval history's least holy women. A nun so scandalous that even the confessional booth might have needed holy water after she was done talking. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 14th century Italy, finding your calling wasn't about spirituality. It was about your father running out of money. If you were the extra daughter in a noble household, congratulations. You were about to be married to Jesus against your will. No dowry, no suitors, no problem. The convent was the medieval version of "we sent her to live on a farm upstate." That's how Lucia of Montferrat entered holy life, kicking, screaming, and probably muttering creative insults about everyone involved. She wasn't pious, humble, or quiet, three qualities that basically defined nuns. What she was: clever, sarcastic, and painfully aware that her family had traded her freedom for eternal boredom. She was 17, too smart for her own good, and not the kind of woman who could stare at a crucifix all day without making a comment about the decor. Her new home, the convent of St. Margaret, was a chilly stone rectangle filled with drafts, discipline, and despair. The rules were simple: pray, fast, and pretend to like it. Talking was discouraged, joy was suspicious, and laughter was borderline heresy. It was the perfect environment for someone with a strong personality and no filter. Lucia made a first impression that historians might kindly describe as catastrophic. On her first day, she asked if the abbess's sermon came in a shorter version. On her second, she fell asleep during morning prayers, standing up. When confronted about her lack of reverence, she replied, "If God wanted me awake at this hour, he'd make dawn later." That earned her her first punishment, and her unofficial title, Sister Problem, while the other nuns spent their days weaving and repenting. Lucia spent hers studying the sisters' weak points. She learned who snuck extra bread, who secretly hated the abbess, and who would trade gossip for honey. Within a month she had more information than the local bishop and twice the attitude. Lucia's letters home, none of which survived because the abbess probably burned them, reportedly complained about the general lack of decent wine, humour, and humanity. She wasn't wrong. And so, in a world where silence was sacred and obedience divine, one teenager decided she'd rather make history by being terrible at both. It wouldn't take long before Sister Lucia stopped being a nun and started becoming a legend. Life inside a medieval convent was a spiritual marathon with no finish line, just more incense, more Latin, and more guilt. Days began at 4 a.m, when the bells rang loud enough to wake the dead, which was ironic since most of the sisters already looked halfway there. Lucia of Montferrat hated mornings, bells, and authority, an unfortunate combination in a place run entirely by all three. The abbess called it discipline. Lucia called it collective suffering with hymns. The routine was relentless. Morning prayers, communal meals, served cold, because God apparently hated flavour, manual labour, then more prayers. Talking was forbidden except for confession, which, coincidentally, became the convent's most popular recreational activity. Some sisters confessed twice a day just to speak to someone. Lucia went weekly, purely to annoy the priest. When asked if she'd sinned, she said, "Not yet, but I have plans." Meals were an experience. The food was designed to remind you of poverty and sadness. Boiled roots, stale bread, and the occasional fish that tasted like it had given up on life long before being caught. Lucia once tried to spice her gruel with crushed herbs from the garden and was accused of worldly culinary pride. She apologised by suggesting that the abbess add a little salt to her sermons too. Silence was another rule. Theoretically, it brought one closer to God. In practice, it brought everyone closer to madness. Nuns communicated through facial expressions awkward gestures, and passive-aggressive sighs. Lucia, however, believed silence was just laziness with extra steps. She hummed, she tapped, she whispered Latin puns. The other sisters prayed for her soul, loudly enough that the irony was lost on no one. Recreation time meant sewing, reading scripture, or weeping softly into your sleeves. Lucia turned embroidery into rebellion, stitching tiny sarcastic messages into altar cloths. Blessed are the bored, and God give me patience but not now. To outsiders, the convent looked peaceful, a haven of holiness tucked away from sin. Inside, it was a slow, pious meltdown where faith met cabin fever. And in that melting pot of boredom, hunger, and repressed emotion, Sister Lucia began planning her next great act of defiance. She'd tried obedience, she'd tried sarcasm, and now it was time to try something riskier, something fun. Every rebellion starts small. Some begin with a whisper, others with a spark. Lucia of Montferrat's began with wine, which, in fairness, has launched most bad ideas in history. The convent of St. Margaret had a small cellar used for sacramental wine, a liquid reserved strictly for communion and absolutely nothing else. Lucia saw this as a tragic waste of potential. One night, while the others were busy praying for humility, she and two equally unholy conspirators crept down to the cellar with candles, mugs, and zero fear of God. What began as quality control turned into the first unofficial feast of St. Hangover. The next morning, morning prayers sounded more like a funeral for good decisions. The abbess noticed the smell of wine in the air and declared it a sign of demonic corruption. Lucia said it was probably just the spirit moving through us. Technically correct, just not the right spirit. It might have ended there, but Lucia had discovered something powerful. Laughter. Not polite giggling behind veils, but full-blown, uncontrollable laughter. In a world where joy was practically contraband, this was revolutionary. Soon she had the younger nuns sneaking extra bread, swapping jokes during psalms, and questioning whether God really wanted them to be miserable. The abbess, naturally, blamed Satan. Her punishments were creative. Lucia was ordered to copy scripture for a month straight. She filled the margins with doodles of sleepy saints and sarcastic commentary. And lo, the Lord said, "Try harder next time." When caught, she claimed divine inspiration. The abbess was not amused. Word of Lucia's misbehaviour began spreading beyond the convent walls. Priests whispered about the girl who mocked the holy tongue. Merchants snickered about that wine-loving sister, and visiting monks suddenly found more reasons to drop by for confession. The convent of St. Margaret, once a model of piety, had become local entertainment. By the end of the year, the abbess had written 3 separate letters to the bishop begging for divine assistance, or at least a transfer. Lucia, meanwhile, had just discovered how to ferment grapes faster. The church saw the first signs of trouble. Lucia saw her first taste of freedom, sweet, forbidden, and served in a chalice. If there was one thing the church feared more than heresy, it was a nun with charisma. And Sister Lucia of Montferrat had enough of it to qualify as a public menace. It began innocently, or at least as innocently as a woman banned from smiling could manage. A visiting priest praised her reading of the Psalms. Lucia, with the kind of confidence that could only come from mild intoxication and lifelong boredom, replied, "Father, I've had plenty of practice speaking to men who don't listen." The sisters gasped so loudly it could have passed for a second choir. From there, the situation devolved beautifully. Priests came to hear confessions and left looking spiritually confused. One reportedly described Lucia as a distraction to the purity of thought. Another confessed later that he wasn't sure if he'd been saving her soul or auditioning for eternal damnation. Her flirtations weren't subtle. When new monks visited with donations, Lucia handled the negotiations, smiling, thanking them for their generosity, and sometimes complimenting their divinely sculpted hands. This was a woman who could turn a conversation about relics into something that required confession afterward. The abbess tried to intervene. Lucia responded by bowing dramatically and saying, "Forgive me, Mother. I was merely spreading the warmth of Christ's love. The abbess ordered more fasting. Lucia took it as an invitation to host a midnight feast, and so the whispers began. Rumours drifted through the village that the nuns of St. Margaret were too joyful, that men entered the convent far too often, and that the chapel smelled faintly of wine and perfume. In an age when the church was cracking down on heresy, laughter and lipstick were practically the same sin. Lucia didn't help her case by writing a hymn dedicated to heavenly desires, which suspiciously sounded like a love poem. When asked to explain it, she claimed divine revelation, that she was exploring the intimacy between the soul and God. The abbess muttered something about blasphemy with rhyme. By this point, Lucia wasn't just breaking rules. She was bending theology. And worse, she was enjoying it. The convent, once a monument of silence and restraint, now buzzed with gossip and barely suppressed giggles. Heaven had competition, and it was coming from inside the cloister. If medieval sin had a sound, it would have been laughter coming from the convent of St. Margaret after midnight. And if it had a face, it would have been Sister Lucia of Montferrat, illuminated by candlelight, grinning like she'd just outsmarted the 10 Commandments. It started small. A few late-night talks among bored nuns, whispering about life before vows, about silk dresses, music, and men who didn't speak Latin. But Lucia had a talent for escalation. One night, she borrowed the abbess's keys, opened the wine cellar, and announced that joy is also a form of prayer. Soon the convent wasn't holding vigils. It was hosting after-hours theology debates, complete with pastries smuggled in by local servants, and the occasional minstrel brave enough to play for a house full of holy women. Reports later described scenes that sounded less like a convent and more like a medieval sleepover gone wrong. Music, dancing, and an alarming amount of bread rolls being thrown in rhythm. Lucia called it celebrating divine creation. The abbess called it an abomination in 4-part harmony. What made things worse was Lucia's sense of showmanship. She dressed up the Virgin Mary statue in ribbons and perfume to make her feel included. She convinced one nervous novice that dancing was a sacred act of joy, quoting scripture loosely enough to make theologians twitch. Her confidence was disarming. She sinned like a professional and explained it like a lawyer. The noise carried. Villagers swore they heard laughter from behind the convent walls. Real laughter, not the restrained, saintly kind. Rumours spread that the sisters were possessed. One merchant claimed he saw silhouettes of dancing nuns in candlelight, moving as if chased by invisible demons. He wasn't entirely wrong. By the time the bishop's messenger arrived to investigate, Lucia had preemptively staged a penitential feast, complete with candles, singing, and suspiciously red wine. When asked to explain the noise, she replied, "Rejoice, for the Lord said to make a joyful noise." The messenger left with more questions than faith. The abbess finally banned evening gatherings, declaring that, after sunset, all should be silent. Lucia nodded obediently, then scheduled the next party for dawn. The convent's reputation was collapsing faster than its wine supply. And somewhere between the prayers and the pastries, Sister Lucia had accidentally founded the medieval version of nightlife. It started with whispers, the kind of whispers that make even the stone walls of a convent lean in. A nun was showing. At first, the sisters blamed poor diet, stress, or perhaps divine inflation. But after the second one began mysteriously gaining weight, silence turned into scandal. Pregnancy inside a convent was like spotting smoke in a fireworks factory. Everyone knew things were about to explode. The abbess fainted. The confessor turned pale. Sister Lucia of Montferrat simply crossed her arms, looked at the chaos she had undoubtedly inspired, and said, "Well, miracles do happen." The investigations began immediately. The church loved nothing more than a scandal they could pretend to be shocked about. Priests were questioned, servants interrogated, and midwives summoned under the pretense of medical curiosity. The abbess swore the devil had entered the convent. Lucia privately agreed, She just left out that he might have entered through the front gate wearing a cassock. The official report, preserved in some poor scribe's trembling Latin, described the discovery of carnal corruption within the house of God. Translated, several nuns were pregnant, and no one was volunteering details. When cornered, one young sister burst into tears and said, "Sister Lucia told us joy was holy." That didn't help. Lucia, of course, denied everything with the confidence of someone who'd practiced in front of a mirror. She blamed temptation, moonlight, weak wine, and even the devil's subtle influence. When asked if she encouraged the others, she said, "Only in faith, and perhaps in bad decisions." The abbess demanded repentance. Lucia offered charm instead. She confessed vaguely, quoted the Song of Solomon, and smiled through every accusation. The priests left her interrogation convinced they'd been spiritually mugged. By now, the convent's reputation had collapsed entirely. Locals whispered that St. Margaret's had become a house of unholy maternity. Merchants joked that it was easier to get wine from the sisters than a prayer. One chronicler even wrote that, "Within those walls, vows are as weak as watered mead." It was no longer a secret. It was a spectacle. The bishop couldn't ignore it. Rome was taking notes, and the abbess was on the verge of spontaneous combustion. Lucia, meanwhile, simply shrugged and said, "If sin spreads this quickly, perhaps joy is contagious." And for once, she wasn't entirely wrong. When the bishop finally came to St. Margaret's convent, it wasn't for a friendly visit or a sermon. It was a full-blown spiritual intervention, the medieval equivalent of corporate sending in head office after too many incidents. Bishop Aldobrandini was a serious man. He had a booming voice, an impressive hat, and the moral flexibility of a marble statue. He'd been warned that the convent was spiritually compromised. He imagined pride, gossip, maybe even sloppy hymn singing. What he found was significantly worse. He arrived at dawn, expecting to catch the sisters in early prayer. Instead, he found Lucia of Montferrat leading what could only be described as a brunch with hymns. There were pastries, laughter, and wine disguised in chalices. One nun was playing a lute, another was asleep, mid-bite. The bishop nearly dropped his staff. Lucia greeted him warmly, curtsied, and said, "Your Grace, how kind of you to join us." The Lord said to welcome all guests. She even offered him bread, which, to be fair, was less of a peace offering and more of a dare. His inspection went downhill from there. The chapel smelled faintly of perfume and guilt. The confession booth contained 2 empty bottles and 1 shoe. He found a locked room filled with fine fabrics, love letters, and something that might have been a lute or a weapon, depending on your faith in music. When he demanded an explanation, the abbess burst into tears, claiming she had lost control of the house. Lucia stepped forward and said calmly, "Control is an illusion, Your Grace. Only faith endures." The bishop wrote that down before realizing she was mocking him. He tried to preach repentance, but halfway through his speech, someone sneezed and Lucia shouted, "Bless you!" The room laughed. The bishop nearly combusted. By sunset, he declared the convent infected by worldly corruption and ordered a full investigation. Before leaving, he told Lucia she was a disgrace to her vows. She smiled sweetly and said, "At least I didn't bore anyone into sin." That night, Lucia toasted her impending doom with the last of the wine. The bishop wanted a confession, she told the sisters. "Tomorrow, I'll give him a performance." The investigation hadn't even started, and she'd already turned it into theatre. When Bishop Aldobrandini left St. Margaret's, he didn't just leave behind outrage. He left behind paperwork. Within a week, an official ecclesiastical investigation began, complete with scribes, witnesses, and a level of self-importance only medieval bureaucracy could produce. 3 men arrived to restore holiness. Father Gregor, who took notes on everything, Brother Paolo, who flinched at sunlight, and a Dominican inquisitor who looked like he'd rather be burning someone. They set up a tribunal table in the chapel under a fresco of the Last Judgment, fitting decor for what was about to unfold. The interrogations began with the quiet nuns. Most wept, some confessed, and a few fainted for dramatic effect. When asked about Sister Lucia of Montferrat, the responses ranged from "she is kind" to "she is the devil in a wimple." Father Gregor underlined that last one twice. Evidence soon followed, and it was glorious. Hidden behind a statue of St. Margaret, the investigators discovered a stash of wine barrels, a box of jewellery, and a lute engraved with the words, "To my most divine muse." In a drawer, they found letters written in Romantic Latin, each signed only with an initial. No one could confirm who SP was, but Lucia's smile during questioning suggested she could. The confessional booth, too, held surprises. Under the bench were several small coins, a half-eaten apple, and a poem that began, "Blessed be the hands that touched the holy veil." Even the Inquisitor blushed. Lucia herself was summoned last. She arrived composed, as if being accused of mass corruption was just another Tuesday. When asked to explain the letters, she said, "Perhaps God writes to all women through the hands of men." The scribe stopped writing to look at her, unsure if it was heresy or poetry. Her calm infuriated them. She quoted scripture, twisted theology, and smiled through every accusation. When they accused her of misleading her sisters, she replied, "If joy is misleading, then sorrow is salvation." That line alone made its way into at least one bishop's diary. By the end of the week, the tribunal had enough evidence to condemn an entire village. But what they didn't realize was that Lucia wasn't afraid of punishment. She was bored of the game. And soon, she'd turn her trial into a masterpiece. Trials in medieval Europe were rarely about justice. They were theatre, and Sister Lucia of Montferrat was about to give the performance of her life. The hall was packed. Priests, nobles, monks, and at least 2 merchants who'd clearly shown up just for the drama. The air was thick with incense, judgment, and the faint smell of wet parchment. Lucia stood before them in her plain black habit, which somehow she made look like a statement. The charges were read aloud: disobedience, blasphemy, seduction, unlawful joy, misuse of sacred wine, and the encouragement of unseemly laughter. That last one received an audible gasp from the audience. Laughter was not a crime, but it might as well have been. Lucia listened patiently, head slightly tilted, like someone hearing a menu she hadn't ordered from. When the bishop asked if she had anything to say in her defence, she clasped her hands and said, "Your Grace, I merely followed the example of our Lord, surrounded by sinners, misunderstood by priests." The room went silent. The scribe actually dropped his quill. The prosecutors pushed harder. They waved the letters, the wine receipts, and even a lute as evidence. Lucia examined them with mild interest and remarked, "I see the Lord's house finally appreciates good music." That didn't help. Witnesses were called. Some wept. Others testified that Lucia encouraged levity unbecoming of holy women. One nervous novice swore Lucia had taught her to laugh during Lent. Lucia smiled faintly and said, "If joy offends heaven, then I fear paradise will be dreadfully quiet." The Inquisitor's patience snapped. He shouted that she had mocked the sacred order. Lucia bowed slightly and replied, "Mockery implies effort, Father. I was merely honest." Even the guard smirked. The verdict, of course, was predetermined. The tribunal declared her guilty of scandalous conduct and corruption of the holy vocation. Her punishment, public penance and lifetime confinement in a stricter convent. Lucia crossed herself politely and said, "At least you didn't excommunicate me. I rather enjoy company." That was the problem with Lucia. No matter how hard they tried to shame her, she kept stealing the spotlight. When the trial ended, the clergy left with their dignity dented, the audience whispered with awe, and Sister Lucia, history's worst nun, left smiling. When the church handed down judgment, it didn't just punish the body, it tried to crush the personality. which in Lucia of Montferrat's case was practically a declaration of war. Her sentencing was to be carried out in full humility and public contrition. Translation: humiliation, starvation, and a new address somewhere the church could pretend she didn't exist. The punishment began with the procession of penance. Lucia was stripped of her finer habit, given a rough wool sack, and paraded through the streets barefoot, holding a candle that dripped faster than she walked. The crowd gathered, peasants gawking, merchants whispering, and one woman reportedly shouting, "At least she made the church interesting again." The priests chanted psalms while Lucia muttered her own commentary under her breath. "Blessed are the meek," they said. "Temporarily," she replied. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. At the steps of the cathedral, she was forced to kneel and beg forgiveness for corrupting others. Lucia knelt, but instead of weeping, she looked up and said, "If joy is sin, then forgive me for spreading it." The bishop, who by now regretted ever hearing her name, simply waved for the guards. Her final destination was a convent fortress outside Siena, colder, stricter, and built specifically to contain women who thought too much. She was to live in silence, fasting twice a week, and speak only to confess her sins. The irony was exquisite. They sent the most talkative woman in Christendom to the quietest place on earth. Upon arrival, Lucia looked around at the grey walls and muttered, "At least the architecture suits the mood." The abbess of her new convent greeted her with frosty authority and the promise of redemption. Lucia smiled faintly and said, "Redemption, I've heard, is overrated." That earned her her first 3 days without supper. Her cell was small, her food tasteless, her company limited to saints painted on the walls, and even they looked like they wanted out. Yet somehow she didn't crumble. If the church wanted remorse, it got sarcasm instead. If it wanted silence, it got subtle rebellion. Lucia's tongue was caged, but her mind and her legend were only just beginning to wander. The new convent was less a house of God and more a holding cell with better acoustics. It sat on a lonely hill outside Siena, surrounded by walls so high they blocked both sunlight and optimism. The sisters there were known for their discipline, their silence, and the complete absence of anything resembling fun. Lucia of Montferrat arrived as their newest cautionary tale. Her reputation preceded her: the laughing nun, the wine of Satan, the unrepentant bride of Christ. The abbess greeted her with the kind of smile usually reserved for lepers and tax collectors. "Here you will find peace," she said coldly. Lucia replied, "If I do, I'll let you know." That earned her 6 hours of kneeling as a spiritual warm-up. Daily life was bleak. The nuns rose before dawn, ate bread that could double as roofing material, and prayed until their knees forgot what comfort felt like. Conversation was forbidden. Even the birds outside had the good sense to stay quiet. Lucia, however, refused to surrender to the monotony. She began scratching little notes into the walls of her cell, short observations, dry and defiant. One read, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, the abbess less so." Another, "Silence may be holy, but it's terribly dull company." She also discovered that candle wax, when melted carefully, could be turned into weak wine. It wasn't good, but it was enough to make her feel human. When caught, she told the guards she was conducting chemical prayer. Despite the endless isolation, Lucia somehow gathered a following. Younger sisters began sneaking glances at her during prayers, drawn by the quiet rebellion in her eyes. She didn't speak to them. She didn't have to. Her presence alone said, "You can think and still survive here." The abbess, furious, ordered her confined even further. No visits, no writing materials, no candles. Lucia simply smiled and said, "Perfect. I've been meaning to work on my inner life." Days bled into months, months into years. And while the abbess thought she'd buried a sinner, She'd accidentally preserved a legend. Lucia's body might have been trapped in stone, but her laughter, quiet, stubborn, and untamed, echoed through every cold corridor. By the time Lucia of Montferrat reached her final years, she had achieved the impossible. She'd made repentance look entertaining. She was thinner now, paler, but her wit had survived starvation better than most saints survived martyrdom. Every rule the abbess enforced became another game to bend, another joke to carve out of misery. When she was forbidden to speak, she learned to communicate through raised eyebrows. When banned from candles, she learned to pray by moonlight. When told to meditate on death, she said, "At least it's something new." The other nuns began to fear and admire her in equal measure. Lucia had turned silence into rebellion, a quiet protest that made obedience look foolish. Even her punishments had lost their sting. When ordered to fast for her insolence, she nodded solemnly and said, "Finally, a diet I didn't invent." Yet the years took their toll. Her body weakened, and her once defiant energy dimmed, but her spirit remained annoyingly intact. The abbess once found her softly humming a love song during evening prayers. When scolded, Lucia smiled and said, "If the Lord didn't want joy in his house, he should have built quieter walls." Rumours began to circulate, as they always do when institutions can't control the narrative. Some said she'd gone mad. Others swore she received visions, that angels came to her cell and left laughing. A priest who visited her near the end described her as a woman of alarming clarity, too aware for her own salvation. When death finally came, it wasn't dramatic. She didn't wail or repent or recite psalms. She simply lay down, whispered something to the ceiling, probably sarcastic, and closed her eyes. The sisters buried her outside the convent walls, as was customary for disgraced nuns. Yet legend claimed the soil above her grave wouldn't stay still. Each morning, it shifted slightly, as if the earth itself were trying to let her out. Years later, pilgrims began visiting her grave, praying not for miracles, but for courage. Because somehow, through all her blasphemy and laughter, Lucia of Montferrat had become something the Church never expected, a symbol of freedom. Not holy freedom, perhaps, but the kind that refuses to kneel just because everyone else does. Lucia of Montferrat was finally dead, but the problem was she refused to stay quiet about it. For the Church, her passing should have been the tidy conclusion to an embarrassing chapter. One less heretic, one less headache. But as it turned out, death did little to stop the gossip, or the laughter. The burial was deliberately simple. No hymns, no candles, and certainly no eulogies. The abbess, who had spent years trying to extinguish Lucia's spirit, ordered her body placed in an unmarked grave outside the convent walls. "Let her rest in silence," she said, but even the ground seemed to disagree. Within days, the soil above the grave began to shift. Not dramatically, just enough for people to notice. Some said it was wind, others said it was restlessness. A few of the younger nuns whispered that Lucia was still trying to get the last word. Then came the stories. A novice swore she heard faint humming near the grave at night. Another claimed she'd seen candlelight flicker in Lucia's old cell when no flame was lit. The abbess dismissed it all as nonsense, until a visiting priest who'd known Lucia in her trial days confessed that he too felt something strange. "A warmth," he said, as if laughter still lingered in the air. Soon, the locals found out. Pilgrims began visiting the grave, praying not for absolution, but for courage. They left offerings, bits of wine, quills, and pieces of ribbon, tokens of the woman who had somehow turned rebellion into a kind of holiness. The Church tried to stop them, of course. But once the public decides someone's a saint, or a celebrity, there's no papal decree strong enough to undo it. Ironically, the same clergy who once condemned her began quietly editing their letters. Perhaps she was misguided, one bishop wrote, but not malicious. That's medieval code for We're losing control of the story. Lucia's legend grew in whispers, not sermons. She became a symbol for the women who didn't fit, the thinkers who talked too much, and the sinners who refused to feel sorry about it. And so, in death as in life, Sister Lucia remained the same. Impossible to contain, impossible to forget, and still somehow getting the final laugh. You'd think death would have improved Lucia of Montferrat's reputation, but in true medieval fashion, it just made things weirder. The church tried to erase her. Her name was scratched out of the convent records, her trial notes quietly misplaced, and her remaining possessions, a quill, a scrap of parchment, and one questionable bottle of herbal remedy, were burned. The official story was that she had been a wayward soul reclaimed by silence, which is exactly what people say when they've lost an argument to a corpse. But stories are stubborn. Within a generation, Lucia became more rumour than memory, passed down by monks who pretended not to enjoy gossip, and by villagers who definitely did. Her legend split into two versions, one pious, one scandalous, both equally unhelpful to church authorities. In the first, she was a warning, a nun who mocked her vows and paid the price. Priests used her as a sermon prop, the medieval equivalent of "don't be like her." She was the textbook example of how laughter leads to damnation, and how women should never trust their own curiosity. Convenient, moral, tidy ending. In the second version, the one whispered in taverns and by restless novices, she became something else entirely. A folk hero, a holy mischief maker who outsmarted bishops and died with her sense of humour intact. Some even claimed she'd performed miracles. A field near her grave supposedly grew wildflowers in winter, and wine blessed in her name never soured. The church dismissed these as false wonders, but pilgrims came anyway. Chroniclers struggled to categorise her. One called her the serpent among lilies. Another, less imaginative, just wrote problematic. Centuries later, an Italian poet referred to her as Saint Lucia the Laughing, which got him excommunicated, then quietly reinstated when his poem became popular. And that was the problem. Lucia's story refused to behave. Every attempt to bury her deeper only made her legend louder. In the end, the church got what it feared most. Not another heretic, but a conversation. A tale that survived because it was too human to die. Lucia of Montferrat stopped being a sinner or a saint. She became something far more enduring, a reminder that holiness, without humour, quickly becomes hypocrisy. Centuries later, Lucia of Montferrat still refuses to disappear quietly into history's background noise. The church might have filed her under spiritually inconvenient, but time has a habit of rescuing the wrong people for all the right reasons. Her story survives in footnotes, folklore, and badly translated monastic gossip. Historians still debate whether she was a libertine, a proto-feminist, or simply someone who realised that holiness didn't have to mean misery. In truth, she was probably all three, a woman born in the wrong century, armed with too much intelligence and far too little patience. To the church, Lucia was a failure. She disobeyed, she laughed, she made faith look human. To modern eyes, that makes her something close to heroic. She didn't start a reformation or burn any cathedrals down, she just refused to be small. And in a world built to keep women silent, that alone was revolutionary. Ironically, her punishment ensured her immortality. The stricter the convent, the louder the whispers. Each century polished her image a little more, from the shameless nun to the woman who wouldn't repent. Plays were written, poems recited, and at least one painter in the Renaissance depicted her smirking in a halo, possibly out of spite. The church never canonized her, of course, but for many she became a sort of unofficial patron saint of laughter, rebellion, and people who ask too many questions. Students light candles by her name during exams. Skeptics toast her on feast days that don't exist. Somewhere Lucia would find all of it hilarious. Her grave, the unmarked patch of dirt outside that silent convent, still attracts visitors. Some leave flowers, others leave wine, all leave quietly smiling. It's said that on still nights you can hear faint laughter carried by the wind, not mocking, not cruel, just a reminder that even within walls built to contain it, joy finds a way out. So yes, maybe she was medieval history's worst nun. She broke every rule meant to cage her and turned damnation into a punchline. But in doing so, she left behind something better than sainthood. She left proof that even in an age of fear and obedience, a single woman's laughter could echo longer than the church that tried to silence it. Victorian Britain prided itself on being the most advanced civilization on Earth. Steam engines thundered through the countryside, gaslights glowed in city streets, and the middle classes congratulated themselves on their progress. Every home wanted to look and eat like success. Dinner tables became miniature theatres of modernity, gleaming silverware, crystal glasses, and dishes so colourful they seemed painted by progress itself. But beneath the elegance lurked something far less civilised, a quiet epidemic of poisoning. You see, the Victorian kitchen was no longer ruled by nature, but by chemistry. Artificial colours, preservatives and flavourings, the kind that would horrify any modern nutritionist, became the new tools of the trade. The more vivid the jelly, the more trustworthy it looked. The greener the peas, the more fresh they appeared. Housewives proudly served pickles that glowed like emeralds, custards yellow as the sun, and candies so bright they could light up a nursery. Yet all that brilliance came from the same industrial cauldrons that produced paints, dyes, and rat poison. The Industrial Revolution didn't just feed Britain, it intoxicated it. With cities swelling and demand rising, merchants sought shortcuts. Why wait for nature when science could give you colour in a bottle? A dash of copper sulfate turned dull pickles into emerald jewels. Arsenic-based dyes made confections irresistibly vivid. Lead acetate sweetened cheap wine. It was progress, the kind that glittered right up until your stomach began to fail. And because food laws were almost non-existent, few questioned what they were eating. The Victorians trusted in progress the way earlier generations trusted in God. If something was sold in a shop, surely it was safe. Newspapers praised chemical innovation, physicians were divided, and only the occasional corpse suggested otherwise. The irony was almost poetic. A society obsessed with purity, moral, social, and spiritual, was slowly being poisoned by its own perfectionism. Every bright dessert was a tiny triumph of technology, every lavish banquet a quiet chemical experiment. Beneath the lace and etiquette, the Victorian appetite had turned lethal. The age of refinement, it seemed, had a distinctly toxic aftertaste. Few sights in Victorian England were more enchanting than a sweet shop window. Rows of glass jars gleamed with rainbow-coloured delights, peppermint drops, lemon lozenges, and hard candies that promised joy to any child with a halfpenny. The air smelled of sugar and innocence. Yet behind that sugary scent lurked something monstrous. Arsenic, the silent killer of the age. Colour was the key to a sweet's success. In an era obsessed with appearances, dull grey candies simply wouldn't sell. Confectioners competed to create the brightest hues, greens, reds and yellows so vivid they seemed magical. Unfortunately, true magic was expensive. Natural dyes like saffron or cochineal cost far too much for the working-class market. So, industry provided cheaper miracles. Synthetic pigments, mixed in factories that also produced wallpaper, paint, and insecticide. One of the most popular was Shields Green, made from copper arsenite. It made candy shimmer like emeralds. It also happened to be deadly. The most infamous case came in Bradford, 1858. A local sweet maker, trying to cut costs, used adulterated plaster powder in his peppermint lozenges. Unbeknownst to him, the plaster was contaminated with pure arsenic trioxide. Within days, more than 20 people were dead, mostly children. Scores more lay writhing in agony. Newspapers dubbed it the Bradford poisoning. Doctors were horrified, yet no law had technically been broken. The sweets had been sold legally by a reputable tradesman to trusting customers who believed the phrase sugar and spice still meant safety. And this wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across Britain, reports surfaced of stomach cramps, vomiting, blindness, and mysterious deaths linked to colourful confections. Still, candy makers defended themselves, insisting they were victims too, that no one knew arsenic could kill in such small doses. A convenient ignorance. In the end, the true horror wasn't just in the poison, it was in the complacency. Parents bought treats for their children with pride, shopkeepers sold them with smiles, and chemists quietly counted their profits. It would take decades of public outrage before regulations even began to appear. By then, countless Victorians had learned the bitter truth. The brighter the candy, the deadlier the secret it held. To the Victorian palate, wine was more than a drink. It was refinement in liquid form. A glass of port after dinner signalled taste, class, and sophistication. Yet even in the finest parlours of London, those ruby tones concealed a dangerous secret. Behind every toast to progress was a quiet sip of poison. The culprit was lead, that ancient companion of civilization and one of its deadliest. The Romans had once sweetened wine with it, calling it sapa or de frutum. The Victorians, in their boundless confidence, repeated the same mistake. Lead acetate, known poetically as sugar of lead, was used to mask the sourness of cheap or spoiled wine. A few grams made the harshest vinegar taste like imported sherry. Merchants found it irresistible, and buyers, none the wiser, drank with pleasure. But lead is not a patient poison. It seeps into the body quietly, gathering in the bones, attacking the nervous system, and turning pleasure into paralysis. Chronic sufferers developed the blue line on their gums, a telltale mark of slow poisoning. Their hands trembled, their vision blurred, their tempers flared for no reason. Some even went mad. Yet, in a cruel twist of irony, the pallor and frailty caused by lead poisoning were considered marks of beauty, especially among women. The sickly complexion of the fashionable elite was literally manufactured by their own dinner parties. Worse still, the contamination wasn't limited to wine. Pewter mugs, lead pipes, and ceramic glazes all added their share of toxins. The more refined the household, the higher the risk, because luxury meant polish, and polish came from chemistry. Even doctors prescribed lead-based tonics for anemia and female weakness, unknowingly worsening the very symptoms they sought to cure. Still, denial persisted. When cases of paralysis and blindness appeared among England's wine drinkers, the press whispered about bad batches or import errors. No one wanted to admit the truth. Industrial greed had corrupted even the communion cup. By the end of the century, as the first food safety laws emerged, the Victorians began to sober up, not from alcohol, but from their own arrogance. They had raised their glasses to progress, and progress had quietly poisoned them. For the Victorians, no meal was complete without pickles. The middle-class table gleamed with jars of preserved cucumbers, onions and cauliflower, bright green, sharp in flavour, and proudly homemade or bought from the local grocer. But these cheerful condiments, meant to liven up the dull roasts and puddings of industrial Britain, carried a secret ingredient straight from the chemist's shelf: copper sulfate. Victorians were obsessed with colour. They equated brightness with freshness. A dull pickle was a dead pickle. Natural brine, however, drained vegetables of their hue, leaving them limp and pale. So, food sellers began adding a pinch of copper salts to restore their healthy green glow. A touch of metallic shimmer made cucumbers look newly plucked, even if they'd been sitting in vinegar for months. The result was stunning to the eye and ruinous to the body. Copper sulfate, in even small doses, corrodes the lining of the stomach, burns the throat, and causes convulsions, vomiting, and kidney failure. Still, shoppers admired these glowing jars as signs of modern ingenuity. Housewives filled their larders with pride. unaware that their family's favourite relish had more in common with a battery than a vegetable garden. Even medical journals of the time warned against the reckless use of metallic salts for the sake of appearance. Yet enforcement was non-existent. Greengrocers simply shrugged. Everyone was doing it. The irony was almost grotesque. The Victorians, champions of cleanliness and moral purity, were cheerfully eating metal. Pickles became the symbol of industrial deceit, beautiful, cheap, and dangerous. Children loved them, labourers ate them with bread for lunch, and socialites spooned them alongside their pheasant. It was democracy in its purest form. Everyone, rich or poor, shared a little dose of corrosion. Only when physicians began reporting widespread copper colic, a charming euphemism for stomach ulcers and organ failure, did suspicion grow. But even then, most dismissed it as coincidence or indigestion from overeating. The truth, of course, was simpler. The colour of progress came with a metallic aftertaste. The same chemistry that made Victorian food beautiful also made it lethal. If bread was the staff of life in Victorian Britain, milk was its comfort. Mothers poured it for their children, doctors prescribed it to the weak, and no morning tea was complete without a splash of it. It symbolised purity, white, wholesome, straight from the countryside. Yet behind that innocent colour was one of the most horrifying scandals of the age. By the mid-19th century, the rapid growth of industrial cities like London and Manchester had created an enormous demand for milk. The problem? Cows didn't live in cities, at least not healthy ones. Urban dairies popped up behind factories where cows were fed on hot brewery waste and kept in filthy stalls without sunlight. The result was blue-tinged, foul-smelling milk barely fit for animals. But that didn't stop dealers from selling it. They simply improved it with chemistry. To disguise the bluish tint, vendors mixed in chalk for whiteness. To thicken the texture, they added plaster of Paris or flour. And to extend the quantity, they cut it with water, often water drawn from contaminated pumps or nearby ditches. Some batches were as much as half sewage. Infants died in droves from what doctors called summer diarrhea, a polite phrase for bacterial poisoning. Others developed rickets, convulsions, or simply wasted away. The public assumed milk was pure because it looked pure. Housewives were reassured by its colour, unaware that the very whiteness they admired came from powdered limestone. Newspapers occasionally reported milk murders, but the outrage faded with every new scandal. No one wanted to believe that something so sacred, so tied to motherhood and innocence, could be corrupted. Eventually, social reformers like Arthur Hill Hassell, a pioneering chemist and food analyst, began exposing the frauds. He examined samples from London's milk cellars and found almost all were adulterated. His reports shocked Parliament, but achieved little immediate change. Only when infant death rates became impossible to ignore did lawmakers reluctantly pass early food safety acts. The tragedy of Victorian milk wasn't just its contamination, it was the betrayal of trust. The same society that worshipped moral purity had built a market that profited from poisoning babies. In the age of progress, even innocence could be industrialised and sold by the pint. To a Victorian household, bread was sacred. It was the measure of a baker's honesty and a family's prosperity. Every morning, loaves lined the shop windows, golden crusts, soft interiors, and that reassuring smell of home. Yet beneath the wholesome image of daily bread hid another industrial deception, the alum loaf, a fraud so common that few even questioned it. Good flour was expensive. The industrial age had driven prices up, and millers eager for profit found a simple trick. They could stretch poor quality flour by mixing in alum, a compound of aluminum sulfate. It whitened dark, coarse flour, made dough rise beautifully, and produced bread that looked pure even when it was anything but. To the untrained eye, the loaf appeared perfect, soft, pale, and refined. To the body, it was slow poison. Alum interfered with digestion, hardening the bread in the stomach and preventing nutrients from being absorbed. Over time, it caused severe constipation, ulcers, and in children, permanent malnutrition. Doctors of the day noted that London's poor were fed yet starved, their bellies full but their bodies wasting. The irony was cruel. The poorer the family, the whiter their bread, and the sicker they became. Some bakers even boasted about the fine whiteness of their loaves, as customers equated purity of colour with purity of ingredients. In truth, whiteness came not from fine wheat, but from chemistry. Even sawdust and pipe clay found their way into cheap bread, while alum masked the taste of decay. Reformers like Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall, who had already exposed the milk scandal, launched campaigns to reveal the adulteration. He tested bread from markets across London and found alum in nearly every sample. Still, the public hesitated to believe it. Bread was too essential, too symbolic to question. Newspapers mocked reformers as alarmists, and bakers defended themselves with feigned outrage. Meanwhile, the working class continued eating their daily rations of industrial chalk and aluminium, never realizing why their children were pale and weak. The staff of life had become a staff of deceit. The bread that filled Victorian bellies was not a blessing from the fields, but a product of chemistry, a triumph of illusion over nourishment. In the empire of industry, even the simplest meal had become an experiment in survival. For the working-class Victorians who could afford it, meat was a luxury, a symbol of strength, vitality, and progress. A roast on Sunday was proof that life was improving. But the demand for cheap cuts in the crowded cities created a gruesome trade where decay met deception. Beneath the market stalls and butchers' smiles, corruption festered. Literally. Refrigeration was still a dream, and meat spoiled quickly in the polluted air of industrial London. Unscrupulous butchers, unwilling to lose profit, relied on chemical trickery to disguise the stench of decay. One of their favourite tools was formaldehyde, a preservative more suited to corpses than cutlets. Soaked or brushed onto meat, it temporarily removed the smell and restored a fresh red colour. Housewives were pleased, the joint looked healthy again. Only later would families discover that their fresh dinner burned in the throat and left a metallic aftertaste. Other tradesmen had their own methods. Some used borax, salicylic acid, or even arsenical dyes to hide mould or insect damage. Potted meat, a popular spread among the poor, often contained the remains of diseased animals, disguised with heavy spices. Sausages, the great equalizer of Victorian cuisine, were a mystery in themselves. Horsemeat, rats, and spoiled organs minced together into something vaguely edible. When reformers exposed these practices, the public was horrified, but only briefly. Hunger has a way of silencing disgust. To make matters worse, slaughterhouses themselves were nightmarish. Many operated behind taverns or in narrow alleys, with blood running into the gutters and flies thick as smoke. The stench was so overwhelming that even nearby residents fell ill. Yet the meat was still sold, washed, polished, and paraded as prime beef. Doctors began noticing strange outbreaks, food poisoning, stomach ulcers, and what they delicately called gastric collapse. In reality, the Victorian dinner table had become a slow-motion autopsy. By the 1880s, social campaigners demanded inspections and standards, but the meat trade resisted fiercely. After all, deception was profitable, and ignorance was abundant. The Victorians believed they were eating the bounty of empire. Beef from Britain, mutton from Australia, pork from the colonies. But in truth, much of it was already half rotten by the time it reached their plates. Industrial progress had given them meat for all, and quietly fed them death by the slice. No beverage defined the Victorian soul quite like tea. It was civilization in a cup, the daily ritual of empire, linking British parlours to Indian plantations and Chinese ports. Every class drank it, dukes in silver teapots, labourers from chipped mugs. But behind the genteel ceremony of afternoon tea lay one of the dirtiest trades in the empire, steeped not in tradition, but in toxins. Tea was big business. Imports flooded into London's docks by the ton, and merchants quickly learned that blending and bulking could double their profits. Genuine tea leaves were often scarce or expensive, so traders improved them with whatever they could find. Dried sloe leaves, elder leaves, even bits of thorn bushes. Once dried, these impostors were dyed dark green or black using Prussian blue, indigo, graphite dust, and copper salts to mimic the glossy sheen of high-quality leaves. To restore the aroma, sellers sprinkled the mix with chemicals, or even recycled used tea from hotels and tea rooms. It was a grotesque act of thrift masquerading as refinement. When steeped, these concoctions released more than flavour. The dyes leached into the water, turning it an unnatural hue and quietly dosing drinkers with heavy metals. Doctors noted widespread cases of tea poisoning, marked by nausea, headaches, and fainting. The poor, who bought their tea loose from barrels in backstreet shops, were the most affected. They thought they were buying a taste of empire. Instead, they were sipping the runoff of industry. Even sugar, that inseparable companion to tea, carried its own peril. It was often cut with plaster dust or sand to increase weight, and whitened with animal bone ash. Every spoonful stirred into a cup was a small act of chemical courage, yet the ritual endured. Afternoon tea became an anchor of Victorian identity, a moment of calm in the industrial storm. No one wanted to believe that such a comforting tradition could be dangerous. Reformers published warnings, but the advertisements won. Pure, fragrant, colonial. The public preferred illusion to discomfort. In the end, the Victorians didn't just conquer the world with tea, they poisoned themselves with it. The empire's most beloved export was, in truth, its most bitter brew. By the late Victorian era, the empire's appetite for beauty, profit, and progress had finally turned on itself. The newspapers that once glorified industrial innovation began to publish grim accounts of the poisoned nation. Physicians, chemists, and journalists joined forces to expose what had long been hiding in plain sight, that Britain's booming food industry was slowly killing its people. The public, once dazzled by colour and convenience, was now haunted by the realisation that even the simplest meal might be a chemical experiment. The first wave of reformers were often dismissed as eccentrics. Men like Arthur Hill Hassell, who painstakingly examined everyday foods under a microscope, revealed that everything from mustard to chocolate contained sand, starch, or metallic dust. He published his findings in The Lancet, horrifying readers but galvanising a movement. Public outrage led to the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, a timid first step that was barely enforced. Manufacturers simply changed their labels and carried on. Progress, after all, was profitable, but deaths mounted, and so did disgust. When scandals like the Bradford arsenic poisoning or the alum bread investigations reached Parliament, the moral tone shifted. The Victorian faith in industry began to waver, replaced by an uneasy suspicion of the very chemistry that had promised salvation. In 1875, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act finally introduced stricter testing and penalties. Inspectors could now seize samples, analyse them, and prosecute offenders. It wasn't perfect, corruption and loopholes thrived, but it marked the beginning of accountability. Slowly, public taste began to change. Whiteness no longer meant purity. Bright colours no longer inspired trust. Cookbooks began warning against chemical deceit, and the emerging middle class started demanding transparency. The moral narrative that once celebrated the progress of science began to celebrate cleanliness, honesty, and naturalness, yet the damage lingered. Generations had been weakened, poisoned, and misled. The industrial miracle that had fed the empire had also taught it a harsh lesson. Not all progress is improvement. By the century's end, the Victorians had created the foundations of modern food regulation, born not from wisdom, but from tragedy. The age that prided itself on refinement had finally learned that the price of beauty in the end was death served politely at the dinner table. Long before independence was signed on parchment, it was brewed in barrels and whispered through the clatter of tankards. Colonial America's taverns were far more than places to drink. They were the nerve centres of a restless society, half pub, half parliament. Every colony had them, from Boston's cobbled lanes to Virginia's dusty crossroads. Inside, smoke curled through candlelight, fiddles played over the noise, and the air carried equal parts beer, sweat, and conspiracy. To a casual observer, the scene was simple: men drinking rum punch or cider after a long day's labour. But beneath that easy laughter, revolutions were fermenting. Taverns offered what few other spaces could: equality, or at least the illusion of it. Farmers sat beside merchants, sailors beside scholars. The tavern table made no distinctions of class when the pitcher was passed, and with ale loosening tongues, complaints about taxes, trade restrictions and royal decrees flowed as freely as the drink itself. In Boston, the Green Dragon Tavern became known as the headquarters of the Revolution. There, men like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams plotted protests disguised as toasts. The Boston Tea Party was not conceived in a parliament chamber, but over mugs of cider beneath a creaking wooden ceiling. Taverns provided privacy too, back rooms where newspapers were read aloud, and pamphlets like Common Sense circulated hand to hand. In an age before mass media, the tavern was the newsstand, the court, and the classroom all in one. Alcohol played its part, not merely as fuel for rebellion, but as social glue. Rum imported from the Caribbean connected the colonies to the same trade networks they despised. Madeira wine from Portugal was the drink of gentlemen, hard cider the pride of farmers. Each carried stories of empire, and each sip reminded colonists of how deeply they were tied to it. That tension, between dependence and defiance, made the tavern both sanctuary and spark. By the 1760s, British officials began to suspect that these public houses were anything but harmless. They were right. Behind the laughter and clinking mugs, a quiet revolution was brewing, one that would soon spill into the streets, as fiery as the rum that inspired it. When English colonists crossed the Atlantic, they didn't just bring tools, Bibles, and muskets. They brought their thirst. The first thing many settlers built after a church and a mill was an alehouse. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. Beer and cider were safer to drink than water, which often carried disease. Even children drank small beer, a weak brew barely stronger than soup. For early Americans, sobriety was the real risk. Colonial alehouses were humble by design: timber walls, packed earth floors, a few rough benches, and a fire that smoked more than it warmed. Yet they quickly became indispensable. Travellers needed food and shelter, locals needed gossip and distraction. News travelled by horse, rumour travelled by tavern. When a ship arrived in port, sailors brought stories, newspapers, and occasionally stolen goods, all traded for drink. In this way, alehouses stitched the colonies together long before postal routes did. They also embodied the social order, and occasionally mocked it. In Puritan New England, taverns were officially frowned upon, yet quietly tolerated. Ministers preached temperance on Sunday and drank punch on Monday. In Virginia, planters conducted business over bowls of rum punch that could dissolve the Queen's liver. The line between sin and necessity blurred with every refill. Taverns were not dens of vice so much as safety valves, places where colonists could vent their frustrations before they boiled over into something worse. Women often ran these establishments, especially widows who inherited licenses from their husbands. They were called tavern mistresses, juggling brewing, bookkeeping, and brawls. One such woman, Mary Fish of Connecticut, kept a journal describing noisy evenings of sailors, farmers, and scholars disputing the fate of nations, while she poured ale and prayed no one broke the furniture. Her tavern was typical, half domestic space, half chaos. But what truly defined the alehouse was its democracy. A poor man with a coin could sit beside a magistrate and argue politics until dawn. For a brief, boozy moment, everyone's voice mattered. These small wooden rooms were America's first debating halls, where loyalty to the crown slowly soured like old cider. Before there was a Congress or a Constitution, there was the alehouse, a place where freedom, quite literally, was on tap. If beer was the drink of daily life in the colonies, Rum was the drink of ambition, sweet, strong, and steeped in empire. By the 18th century, rum had become the unofficial currency of colonial America. Distilled from Caribbean molasses, it flowed through every port, every tavern, every revolution in waiting. Rum connected New England merchants, West Indian plantations, and African slave traders in one vast, brutal triangle of profit. Every mug of rum poured in a Boston tavern carried the aftertaste of global exploitation. It was cheap, potent, and democratic. Governors toasted with it, sailors drowned in it. The colonial palate demanded variety, and taverns obliged by mixing rum with citrus juice, sugar, and spices into elaborate punches served in great communal bowls. A proper tavern punch could contain a dozen ingredients and enough alcohol to dissolve conversation into shouting within an hour. These bowls were the social equivalent of social media feeds. Information, rumour, and opinion all blended together until no one remembered who said what first. The ingredients themselves told a story of empire. Lemons and limes from the Caribbean, nutmeg from the East Indies, sugar from enslaved labour, and rum from distilleries in Barbados or Rhode Island. A single drink was a map of colonial greed. Yet for the men raising their tankards in taverns from Philadelphia to Charleston, it was simply the taste of belonging. To drink rum was to be part of the Atlantic world, to share in its wealth and, unknowingly, its crimes. In cities like Boston, tavern cellars held barrels of imported Madeira and claret for those who fancied refinement. But rum remained the national favourite, unpretentious, powerful, and rebellious. Even the taxes imposed by Britain on molasses and imported spirits backfired spectacularly. Rather than discourage consumption, they inspired smuggling, protest, and resentment. Every sip became an act of quiet defiance. By the 1760s, British officials complained that American colonists were half-drunk and wholly insolent. They weren't entirely wrong. Rum fueled the working class and the revolutionaries alike. It greased the gears of trade and treason, and by the time independence was declared, rum had already done its work. It had united the colonies, not through speeches, but through hangovers. In the 18th century, the tavern was not just a drinking hole. It was a stage, and every patron played a part. Beneath the flickering glow of tallow candles, speeches were made, pamphlets read aloud, and tempers flared as easily as the hearth fire. In a world without radios, newspapers, or public halls large enough to host crowds, the tavern became the people's parliament. Here, the colonial appetite for freedom found its first audience. In cities like Boston, New York, and Williamsburg, taverns became unofficial headquarters of politics. Each had its own character, some loyal to the crown, others breeding grounds for rebellion. The Raleigh Tavern in Virginia was famous for its Apollo Room, where the colony's House of Burgesses met in secret after the royal governor dissolved them. At the City Tavern in Philadelphia, delegates of the Continental Congress dined, debated, and occasionally drank enough to forget diplomacy entirely. A cask of Madeira often succeeded where logic failed. Tavern culture blurred the line between civility and sedition. A toast might sound harmless. To liberty. But in a British colony, such words carried the weight of treason. As men drank, ideas became bolder. Arguments about taxes turned into strategies for protest. Gossip became planning. The tavern gave rebellion a public voice without needing a printing press. Even literacy wasn't required. One man could read a pamphlet aloud while the rest roared their approval or jeered at the king's name. Theatricality was part of the charm. Patrons staged mock trials of unpopular officials or mock funerals for British laws, complete with coffin and song. Every performance blurred into politics, and politics into performance. Ordinary men who might never see a courtroom suddenly became actors in history. The drink made them fearless. The crowd made them united. To the authorities, taverns were tinderboxes. British officers tried to spy on them, sometimes even infiltrating in disguise, though the accent usually gave them away before the second round. Banning them was impossible. There were too many. and they served too many needs. By the time the first shots of revolution were fired, the colonies were already well rehearsed. The stage had been set, not in a palace or parliament, but in smoky rooms where ale, laughter and rebellion shared the same table. While the image of the colonial tavern is often painted in pipe smoke and patriots, women stood behind the bar, and sometimes in front of it, shaping the entire culture. Far from being mere bystanders, they were its heartbeat. Many taverns were run by widows, who inherited licenses after their husbands' deaths, though some women earned them outright. They were known as tavern mistresses, part entrepreneur, part peacekeeper, part spy. Running a tavern was no genteel business. These women brewed ale, managed books, butchered meat, and occasionally broke up fistfights with a broom handle. Their clientele ranged from farmers and travellers to scholars and smugglers, and every night brought a new mixture of business, gossip, and chaos. Mary Fish of Connecticut once wrote that her nights were filled with sailors arguing politics, merchants boasting of fortunes not yet made, and boys pretending to be men through drink. Her tone was weary, but proud. She knew her establishment was more than a pub. It was a crossroads of the new world. For many women, tavern keeping was one of the few legitimate ways to achieve financial independence. They could hold property, earn income, and participate in public life, privileges often denied elsewhere. A successful tavern mistress wielded influence that rivaled any town official. Patrons needed her favour for credit, merchants sought her connections, and travellers relied on her word for local news. Of course, not everyone admired such independence. Clergymen denounced tavern women as encouragers of vice and distractors from domestic duty. But the hypocrisy was hard to miss, since many of those same moralists enjoyed a discreet glass of rum punch when the sermon was done. Female tavern keepers learned to navigate these contradictions with wit and survival instinct. Some used their establishments as information hubs, or in wartime, as intelligence posts. During the Revolution, Lydia Darrah, a Philadelphia innkeeper, famously overheard British officers planning troop movements in her home and smuggled word to the Continental Army. Her bravery blurred the line between hostess and hero. The tavern, for these women, was more than business. It was power disguised as hospitality. Beneath every cheerful "another round" was quiet authority. In an age when women were expected to be silent, the tavern mistress made sure the world kept talking, and often listening. If the revolution had a flavour, it would have been brewed, distilled, or fermented. Colonial America's politics were drunk as much as they were debated, and every region had its signature spirit. Each drink told a story, not just of taste, but of geography, class, and identity. Cider was the drink of the common man. Apples grew in abundance, and even the poorest farmers could press a barrel for winter. Cider was currency, medicine, and breakfast. In New England, children drank small cider in place of water. John Adams famously downed a tankard of it every morning before writing essays on liberty, proof that one could be both patriotic and perpetually buzzed. Rum, on the other hand, was the lifeblood of trade. Imported molasses from the Caribbean was distilled in coastal towns like Newport and Boston. A good distillery was a license to print money. Rum warmed sailors, bribed politicians, and paid wages. In a strange irony, the same drink that fueled independence also tied the colonies to the slave-driven economy of the Sugar Islands. Every glass carried both pride and guilt. For those aspiring to refinement, there was Madeira wine, the aristocrat's favourite. Imported from Portugal, it was sturdy enough to survive the long Atlantic voyage and elegant enough for toasts in the halls of Congress. George Washington ordered it by the barrel. Thomas Jefferson filled his cellars with it. Madeira symbolised sophistication, and hinted that even revolutionaries preferred their rebellion with a touch of class. Meanwhile, frontier settlers brewed their own fierce concoctions. Corn whiskey, the ancestor of bourbon, was raw, smoky, and unapologetic, the liquid emblem of American grit. It flowed from stills hidden in the hills, untaxed and ungoverned. In those wild places, distilling was both livelihood and declaration. If Britain could tax tea, the frontier would make its own drink. Together, these beverages formed the social bloodstream of early America. They fueled tavern debates, sealed trade deals, christened ships, and comforted widows. They weren't just drinks, they were rituals of belonging. To refuse a toast was to refuse community. And as colonists raised their mugs to liberty, they might not have realised it, but they were also toasting to their own invention, a new culture, spirited in every sense of the word. Before newspapers became reliable, the tavern was the newsroom of the colonies, a place where information didn't just circulate, it fermented. The moment a traveller stepped off his horse, he was greeted not with "welcome," but "what's the news?" In a world without radio or telegraph, gossip was currency, and taverns were the mint. Inside, someone was always reading aloud from the latest issue of the Boston Gazette or Pennsylvania Chronicle, while others leaned in, mug in hand, to debate its contents. The fire crackled, ale sloshed, and arguments flew faster than the ink could dry on the next edition. These readings weren't just entertainment, they were public education. Many patrons couldn't read, but they could listen and repeat. By nightfall, the day's news had travelled through an entire town by word of mouth. Taverns became information crossroads, where sailors brought foreign reports, merchants relayed market prices, and politicians tested public opinion. A clever innkeeper could predict revolutions just by listening. Letters were left at taverns for travellers to carry along the post road, and some establishments even doubled as makeshift post offices. A single building could serve as inn, parliament, printing press, and rumour factory all at once. The political pamphlet, that explosive weapon of the Enlightenment, found its greatest audience not in libraries, but in taverns. Thomas Paine's common sense spread from one ale-stained table to another like wildfire. Men debated its every line until the arguments themselves became acts of rebellion. It's no exaggeration to say that independence was first discussed under the influence of cider and newsprint. But taverns were not neutral. Each had its own allegiance, often advertised through subtle symbols. A signboard, a portrait of the king, or the absence of one. Loyalist taverns catered to officers and merchants, patriot taverns filled with radicals and smugglers. The choice of where to drink became a political statement. By the 1770s, the British government understood that the war of ideas was being fought in these smoky rooms. Attempts to suppress tavern meetings only confirmed their power. Every rumour, every toast, every whispered plot moved faster than any army. The colony's greatest communications network was built not on wires, but on ale, conversation, and courage. For all their camaraderie and conversation, colonial taverns had a darker side. Beneath the laughter, music, and patriotic speeches lurked a culture of excess that sometimes turned freedom into frenzy. Alcohol was the great equalizer and the great undoing. In an age before clean water or refrigeration, drinking was nearly universal, but moderation was not. The average colonist consumed more alcohol per year than modern Americans drink coffee. Rum, cider, beer, and whiskey flowed from sunrise to midnight. Labourers drank before work, to steady the hand, and afterward to cool the spirit. Court records from the period are filled with tavern brawls, public indecency, and debts paid in drink. What began as a meeting place for ideas could easily devolve into chaos. The moral guardians of the colonies, especially Puritan ministers, saw taverns as both temptation and necessity. They denounced drunkenness from the pulpit, but stopped short of banning drink altogether. The hypocrisy was legendary. Sermons against vice were often delivered by men who had just stopped at the tavern for a quick brandy. Still, the tension between virtue and indulgence gave rise to one of America's first reform movements, the Temperance Crusade. Women, who often bore the brunt of drunken husbands, began organising petitions and societies urging moderation. Pamphlets warned that the rum bottle does more harm than the musket, and travelling preachers compared the tavern to the gates of hell. The irony, of course, was that taverns had also birthed the revolution that gave these reformers the freedom to speak. America's liberty, it seemed, came with a hangover. Violence was common, political disagreements often escalated into duels, while card games ended with smashed tankards and broken noses. Yet even these incidents reflected the spirit of the time: passion without restraint, conviction without caution. The same fire that made men defy a king also made them punch a neighbour. By the early 19th century, the tavern's reputation had split in two. It was both cradle of democracy and den of sin. The same tables that once held the Declaration's rough drafts now hosted arguments about morality and self-control. The colonies had won independence, but not immunity from their vices. In every glass, they tasted both freedom and its cost. When the smoke of revolution cleared and the colonies became a nation, the tavern did not fade, it evolved. The same wooden tables that once echoed with rebellion now hosted debates over the Constitution, westward expansion, and the building of a new republic. The colonial tavern had been a seedbed for democracy, and even as cities grew and newspapers multiplied, its influence lingered in the American psyche. The belief that politics belonged not to palaces, but to the people. Out of those noisy rooms grew the public house, the saloon, and eventually the American bar, each carrying echoes of its ancestor. The tavern spirit lived on in every town hall and roadside diner where strangers still talk politics over coffee or whiskey. In a country that prizes individualism, the tavern reminded everyone that freedom began as a shared conversation. It was, quite literally, the birthplace of public opinion. Architecturally, the colonial tavern vanished, but its functions scattered across society. The press inherited its role as the nation's storyteller. Universities became its debating halls. Hotels replaced its beds and hearths. Yet none of these quite matched the intimacy of those candlelit rooms, where farmers argued with philosophers and sailors traded news with scholars. The tavern was democracy's original classroom, open to anyone who could afford a pint and an opinion. Even reform movements that despised drinking owed something to it. The temperance societies, the abolitionists, and the women's suffrage movement all met in public spaces modelled after the tavern, open, inclusive, buzzing with argument. America's greatest revolutions were born not in silence, but in noise. Today, when you walk into an old colonial inn still standing, like the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg or the City Tavern in Philadelphia, you can almost hear the echoes. Wooden floors creak, mugs clink, and somewhere in the past, a voice is shouting, "To liberty!" It's easy to forget that these places weren't just about drink, they were about connection. The legacy of the colonial tavern isn't preserved in dusty bottles or faded signs. It survives every time strangers gather to talk freely, in bars, cafes, online forums, and living rooms. The revolution it started never really ended. It simply changed tables. When a medieval knight swore to take the cross, he wasn't simply agreeing to fight. He was binding his soul to a sacred mission. The ceremony was half religious ritual, half theatrical transformation. Before departure, a priest would bless the knight's sword, sprinkle him with holy water, and stitch a crimson cross upon his cloak. From that moment, his life was no longer his own. He was militis Christi, a soldier of Christ. But the true meaning of that oath was more complicated than the church cared to admit. The code of chivalry was supposed to be clear: protect the weak, honour your word, and fight only for just cause. Yet in the chaos of the Crusades, those ideals often blurred. The knight's world was one of contradictions. Piety mixed with pride, sanctity with slaughter. Many took the vow for faith, others for land or reputation. Some were devout pilgrims, others were opportunists wrapped in armour and absolution. To kill in the Holy Land was not sin but service, provided, of course, you killed the right people. Still, the notion of chivalry offered a moral compass, however shaky. A crusader was expected to be both warrior and saint, fierce in battle, yet merciful to the fallen. Chronicles speak of knights pausing mid-fight to grant mercy or share water with an enemy, gestures that seemed miraculous amid the blood. To die in battle for God was the ultimate redemption. To break one's vow was damnation, but temptation was everywhere. The spoils of Jerusalem glittered brighter than virtue. Plunder, ransom, and vengeance often spoke louder than prayer. Even the holiest warriors found themselves wrestling between devotion and desire, and the church, ever pragmatic, turned a blind eye as long as victories were won. The sword was sanctified, the sin negotiable. To the outside world, these armoured pilgrims were divine heroes. To those who rode among them, the truth was more human. The oath of the cross demanded purity, yet the road to salvation was paved with ambition, greed, and blood. Each knight rode east believing himself a holy servant. But in the deserts of Syria and the streets of Jerusalem, many discovered that the greatest battle wasn't against infidels, but against their own souls. Before a man could wield a sword for Christendom, he had to learn to wield one for survival. The making of a Crusader knight began in childhood, not with prayer, but with discipline, bruises, and obedience. From the age of 7, noble boys were sent from their family homes to serve as pages in another lord's household. They learned to polish armour, tend horses, and serve wine at banquets, all while absorbing the manners of the court. By 14, they became squires, one step closer to the gilded illusion of knighthood. A squire's life was a paradox. He trained daily with blunted weapons, practiced jousting until his ribs ached, and memorized codes of honour that few would live by. His master's behaviour became his education. If that master was pious, the boy learned humility. If cruel, he learned how to disguise cruelty with courtesy. At night, the squire cleaned mail shirts caked with mud and blood, wondering whether the legends of noble knights had ever been true. When the First Crusade called Europe to arms, this system produced a generation perfectly suited to its cause, disciplined, ambitious, and accustomed to hierarchy. They were taught that obedience was virtue and violence, when sanctified was holy. The Church capitalized on this conditioning, recasting the knight's role from vassal to defender of the faith. A warrior who once fought for his lord's manor now fought for God's kingdom. The rhetoric was intoxicating. Sin could be washed away with a single campaign, paradise guaranteed by courage and blood. The ceremony of knighthood, adoubement, was steeped in symbolism. The young man bathed to purify his body, prayed through the night to cleanse his soul, and at dawn received his sword in the name of the Church. The priest's blessing transformed him from soldier to servant of heaven. But that same ritual also sanctioned what followed: slaughter, conquest, and vengeance as righteous acts. In essence, the Crusader was manufactured through ritualized contradiction. He was trained to kill, but told it was mercy, taught humility, yet promised glory, bound by faith, yet driven by ambition. By the time he set sail for the Holy Land, he carried not only a sword and shield, but the impossible weight of being both sinner and saint. When the Crusader knights first glimpsed the walls of Jerusalem, they believed themselves chosen instruments of God. For weeks, sermons had promised them salvation. Now the holy city shimmered before them like a divine mirage. Yet once the gates fell, heaven quickly gave way to hell. The ideals of chivalry, mercy, restraint, honour, dissolved in the heat of victory. According to chroniclers, the streets of Jerusalem flowed with blood up to the ankles. It was not the triumph of saints, but of soldiers. Here lay the central paradox of Crusader honour. A knight was sworn to protect the innocent, yet on campaign, innocent became a flexible term. Saracen civilians were slaughtered without remorse, Jews burned alive in their synagogues, women enslaved as prizes of conquest. And yet, after each massacre, priests blessed the victors and declared their sins forgiven. To kill in God's name was not crime, but cleansing. Still, within that chaos, some knights clung to the chivalric code like a relic in a storm. Men such as Tancred of Hauteville, famed for his courage and compassion, reportedly offered protection to women and priests during the sack of Jerusalem. Others upheld rules of ransom, preferring to capture enemies rather than kill them, a small, almost futile gesture of restraint amid madness. To these knights, honour was not in victory, but in how it was won. The harsh desert tested both faith and morality. Food rotted, water was scarce, and the corpses of comrades reminded crusaders daily that death came faster than glory. Under such conditions, chivalry often bent to survival, yet even then the myth endured. The image of the noble knight in shining armour persisted in chronicles written for European audiences who would never see the filth and horror of the Levant. It was easier to worship the symbol than face the truth. By the time the first crusading armies returned home, they carried relics and scars in equal measure. Many were celebrated as holy warriors, yet haunted by what they'd done. For every tale of honour, there were 100 left untold, of greed, cruelty, and lost faith. In the Holy Land, chivalry had not been destroyed. It had been tested, and more often than not, found wanting. Out of the blood and chaos of the First Crusade rose an order unlike any before it, a brotherhood of monks who fought like knights and prayed like saints, the Knights Templar. Founded around 1119 by Hugues de Payan and a small band of companions, their mission was deceptively simple: to protect Christian pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem. But what began as a handful of poor knights soon became the most powerful military order in Christendom, guided by a code that fused chivalry with monastic discipline. Every Templar took the 3 vows of a monk: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They owned nothing individually, not even their weapons, and slept in communal halls on straw mats beside their horses. Their white mantles, adorned with a red cross, symbolized purity and sacrifice, a visual promise to live and die for God. The Templar rule, approved by the Church, demanded strict devotion. No idle talk, no gambling, no swearing, no private possessions. In theory, a Templar's life was one of holy simplicity. In practice, it was an unending test of loyalty and restraint. Unlike ordinary crusaders, the Templars saw battle not as opportunity, but as penance. To die in combat was not failure, it was salvation. The rule forbade retreat unless outnumbered 3-1, and even then, only with permission. Their discipline was legendary. Chroniclers wrote that they charged like a single man, silent beneath their white banners, marked with the boson, their black and white standard, symbolizing the struggle between good and evil. Yet, for all their sanctity, the Templars were not immune to worldly temptation. Their courage made them indispensable to kings. Their piety made them trusted by the Church. Soon, donations poured in, lands, gold, castles, until the poor knights became Europe's bankers and power brokers. They built fortresses across the Holy Land, guarded trade routes, and lent money to monarchs who prayed for their souls and borrowed for their wars. Thus, the paradox deepened. The Templars preached poverty but amassed wealth, swore obedience but influenced popes, claimed humility yet stood above princes. Their code was pure, their conduct often not. Still, to their enemies, they remained the iron heart of Christendom, warriors who believed death on the battlefield was not loss, but eternal victory. If the Templars represented the sword of the Crusades, the Knights Hospitaller were its shield. Their origin lay not in conquest, but in compassion. Long before Jerusalem was taken by Crusaders, a group of monks had established a small hospital there, a refuge for weary pilgrims seeking care after the long, perilous journey to the Holy Land. When the First Crusade transformed that pilgrimage into holy war, the hospital's caretakers took up arms. They became warrior monks, bound by faith, yet tempered by mercy. The Hospitallers swore the same vows as other religious orders: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But their rule emphasized service. They were healers first, soldiers second. Every knight was expected to tend to the sick, wash their feet, and feed them before himself. Their motto, Tuitio fidei et obsequium pauperum, defence of the faith and service to the poor, captured the dual nature of their mission. Their black robes, marked with a white cross, became symbols of protection and aid. Within the thick walls of their hospitals, pilgrims found not only medical treatment, but dignity. Chroniclers noted that the hospitallers' infirmaries were so clean and orderly that the sick lay as if in paradise. Yet beyond those serene halls, the knights were fierce in battle. They guarded roads, escorted caravans, and defended fortresses across the Holy Land, and later the Mediterranean. Their fort at Crac de Chevalier in Syria became a legendary stronghold, part monastery, part fortress, part miracle of endurance. Still, the Hospitallers' charity was not without contradiction. Their wealth grew with their fame. Donations poured in from across Europe, estates, castles, even entire villages. The knights who began by tending the poor eventually commanded fleets and armies. Their hospitals became hospitals of empire, places where faith met power. Yet, unlike other orders, the Hospitallers maintained a sense of humility through action. When plague struck, they nursed the infected rather than flee. Even their enemies respected them. Muslim chroniclers recorded acts of mercy, noting that wounded foes were sometimes treated alongside Christian patients. The Hospitaller Knight was a rare fusion of monk, doctor, and warrior, proof that chivalry, at its best, could heal as well as harm. In the shadow of conquest, they embodied what the Crusades so often forgot. That true strength was found not only in courage, but in compassion. While Europe glorified its Christian knights as paragons of honour, the Crusaders soon discovered that their Muslim adversaries, the Saracens, had a chivalric code of their own, one that often surpassed their own ideals. On the other side of the battlefield, warriors of Islam lived by the principles of futuwah, a blend of courage, generosity, and moral integrity. Much like Christian chivalry, it was less about religion and more about virtue under fire. To the Crusaders, the Saracens were at first painted as infidels and barbarians, but contact, often through war, sometimes through truce, forced a re-evaluation. Many knights, hardened by years of bloodshed, found their enemies more disciplined, cultured, and merciful than themselves. Among them rose legendary figures like Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. To Muslims, he was a defender of faith. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of noble warfare. Saladin's reputation for mercy became the gold standard of knightly behaviour. When Jerusalem fell to him in 1187, he did not slaughter the populace as the Crusaders had done a century earlier. Instead, he offered ransoms and pardons. Women and children were spared. Even the city's churches remained standing. Chroniclers from both sides recorded his actions with awe. Richard the Lionheart himself, though an enemy, admired Saladin's honour. The two even exchanged gifts during truces, including a falcon and a prized Arabian horse. This exchange of respect across religious lines reshaped the meaning of chivalry. Crusaders who survived long campaigns in the East returned to Europe with tales of Saracen refinement, their poetry, medicine, and courtesy in both battle and diplomacy. In contrast, many realized that their own conduct often fell short of their professed ideals. The enemy, it seemed, had mastered the very virtues Christianity claimed to own. The Saracens also practiced restraint in warfare that shocked Europeans. They valued courage but not cruelty, valor but not vanity. Even in victory, they sought dignity over vengeance. To many crusaders, this was both humbling and haunting. It revealed a truth that lingered long after the wars ended: that chivalry was not born in Europe, nor owned by any faith. It was a universal code, found wherever honour endured amid chaos. For all its lofty ideals, the crusading world was rife with betrayal. Knights who swore to uphold faith and honour often broke both when profit or power beckoned. Behind the shining armour and pious vows lay a theatre of ambition, envy, and greed. The code of chivalry, meant to sanctify the battlefield, became in many cases a costume worn for respectability. The rot began early. During the First Crusade, Rival nobles bickered over titles and loot before they even reached the Holy Land. When the city of Antioch was finally captured, Christian armies turned on one another over who deserved to rule it. While priests sang hymns of triumph, knights drew swords against their own allies. Honour, it seemed, was negotiable when gold or glory was involved. By the later Crusades, this hypocrisy had become institutional. The Fourth Crusade, called to reclaim Jerusalem, instead sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the East. Latin knights plundered cathedrals, desecrated altars, and looted relics in the name of God. Byzantine citizens were slaughtered by men wearing crosses on their cloaks. No Saracen army had inflicted such humiliation upon Christendom, only its own soldiers had. The chivalric code, once intended to protect the Church, had become its weapon and its shame. Even the holy orders were not immune. The Templars and Hospitallers, once allies, turned into bitter rivals, vying for influence over kings and popes. Their fortresses became fortresses of pride. In the Levant, knights betrayed truces for land, sold Christian prisoners back to Muslims for ransom, and ignored papal commands when convenient. For every oath sworn, wrote one chronicler, 2 were broken before sunset. The contradictions were glaring. Preachers promised forgiveness of sins to crusaders who took the cross, yet many returned home spiritually hollow, haunted by atrocities they had committed in God's name. Others grew rich, their newfound estates paid for with plundered silver and blood. To the cynical observer, the Crusades were not holy wars, but holy opportunities. Still, even amid this corruption, a few knights clung to the ideals they had been taught: courage, loyalty, humility. They became the rare exceptions that kept the myth of chivalry alive. Yet, by the end of the Crusades, that myth was cracked beyond repair, its purity drowned in the very sins it sought to conquer. By the late 13th century, the once glorious crusading orders stood like weathered fortresses, proud on the outside, hollow within. The Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights had outlasted the Crusades themselves, but victory had curdled into suspicion. The Holy Land was lost, the Saracens victorious, and Europe had grown weary of financing holy wars that brought little holiness and even less success. The knightly orders, built on vows of poverty and purity, had become powerful, wealthy institutions, and in a world that distrusted power, that was their undoing. The Templars, in particular, had become too rich, too secretive, and too independent. Their vast estates stretched from Scotland to Cyprus. Their treasuries rivaled those of kings. They lent money to monarchs, managed pilgrim routes, and even created an early form of banking. But influence breeds envy. When King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Templars, looked for a way out, he turned to accusation. In 1307, on a cold October morning, the king's agents struck. Templars across France were arrested on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and devil worship. They were accused of spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and kissing each other's backsides, lurid fabrications designed to shock the faithful and justify seizure of their wealth. Under torture, confessions flowed as freely as the lies. The once feared warrior monks were paraded as traitors to God. Pope Clement V, caught between conscience and the French crown, disbanded the order in 1312. Its leaders were executed, most famously Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, who was burned at the stake in Paris. As the flames rose, he reportedly cursed both king and pope, predicting divine retribution. Within a few years, both were dead. The Hospitallers survived, retreating first to Rhodes and then Malta, transforming into a naval power that battled the Ottoman Turks for centuries. Yet even they were no longer purely holy warriors. They were soldiers of politics as much as faith. The fall of the Templars marked the end of the crusading dream. Chivalry, once the moral armour of Christendom, had become a relic. The cross that had once symbolised sacrifice now stood as a warning. No vow, no code, no knight was immune to corruption when God's name became a weapon in men's hands. When the dust of the Crusades finally settled, what remained was not the triumph of faith, but the ghost of an ideal. The code of chivalry, once meant to elevate war into virtue, survived long after the Crusader kingdoms crumbled. It lingered in poetry, in legend, and in the imaginations of those who needed to believe that honour could survive brutality. But the truth, as always, was tangled. From the ashes of the Holy Land rose the myth of the noble knight, brave, pure, and loyal to God and lady alike. Troubadours sang of gallant crusaders battling heathens by day and wooing virtue by night. The grim realities of starvation, greed, and massacres were quietly edited out. What had been a campaign of conquest became, in memory, a romance of righteousness. Europe needed heroes, not butchers, and chivalry provided them. Writers like Chrétien de Troyes and later Geoffrey of Monmouth transformed real crusaders into shining archetypes: Lancelot, Galahad, and the knight of spotless virtue. The battlefield became a stage for moral drama, where faith and courage triumphed over chaos. Even kings adopted the language of chivalry to polish their rule. Orders like the Garter in England and the Golden Fleece in Burgundy claimed descent from the crusading spirit, though their battles were fought more with etiquette than swords. Ironically, the more Europe civilized itself, the more romantic the Crusades became. By the Renaissance, the blood-soaked campaigns of the 12th century had been recast as a golden age of honour. Artists painted knights kneeling before ethereal ladies, poets turned massacre into melody. Yet beneath the myth, the contradictions endured. The same ideals that justified mercy also sanctified murder, and the same code that preached humility also glorified conquest. Still, chivalry left behind a moral vocabulary that shaped centuries of thought. Concepts like noble cause, honour in war, and mercy to the defeated all trace their lineage to those medieval vows sworn beneath the cross. Even modern soldiers, in their oaths and conduct, echo fragments of that forgotten creed. In the end, the code of chivalry was less a rule-book than a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of those who wielded it. In the Crusades, that mirror cracked, but it never shattered. Its shards still glint in every struggle between faith and humanity that history dares to repeat.